What's the single privilege which every elite claims? Never mind if its members are hardworking or lazy, brilliant or stupid, humane or despicable, wealthy or impoverished, exclusive or indiscriminate, prestigious or infamous, such that it will throw the entire world into disorder, slaughtering thousands in war rather than surrender its prerogative. The answer is that the members of every elite consider themselves exempt from having to perform the inglorious, tedious, mind-numbing, repetitive, exhausting, dirty work required to keep civilization raised an inch or two above the muck of chaos. They would sooner destroy the planet rather than have to perform manual labor on a daily basis. The following passage in Herodotus makes clear as day this predilection for floating through life on a stream of leisure, dotted with pleasant islands of gamesmanship, a characteristic as valid for current elites as for ancient ones. Quote, all the men assembled with their billhooks, and Cyrus's next command was that before the day was out they should clear a certain piece of rough land full of thorn bushes, about 18 or 20 furlongs square. This too was done, whereupon Cyrus issued the further order that they should present themselves the following day, after having taken a bath. Meanwhile Cyrus collected and slaughtered all his father's goats, sheep, and oxen, in preparation for entertaining the whole Persian army at a banquet, together with the best wine and bread he could procure. The next day the guests assembled, and were told to sit down on the grass and enjoy themselves. After the meal, Cyrus asked them which they preferred, yesterday's work or today's amusement, and they replied that it was indeed a far cry from the previous day's misery to their present pleasures. This was just the answer which Cyrus wanted. He seized upon it at once and proceeded to lay bare what he had in mind. Men of Persia, he said, listen to me. Obey my orders, and you will be able to enjoy 1,000 pleasures as good as this, without ever turning your hands to menial labor. But if you disobey, yesterday's task will be the pattern of innumerable others you will be forced to perform. Take my advice and win your freedom. I am the man destined to undertake your liberation, and it is my belief that you are a match for the Medes in war as in everything else. Here, to win one's freedom means to free oneself from work by enslaving someone else, for the only way one can live free from toil is to defeat one's enemy in war. So, anciently, the purpose of war was to enslave a workforce so that you wouldn't have to exhaust yourself performing physical labor. You risked your life in war in order to enjoy it in peace. I don't mean to imply that the leisure class didn't have social responsibilities. On the contrary, in the word munificent, which means generous or lavish, one hears the mu of mural, for it was the duty of the ancient munificent class, the aristocracy, to donate the walls of a city and to organize and lead the military force which defended those walls against foreign invasion. Correspondingly, it is the duty of big money today to safeguard the economy, the walls of the modern nation, by creating investment and employment opportunities and by supporting educational and charitable foundations. Nevertheless, the higher one rises in any hierarchy, whether ancient or modern, the more flexible one's schedule, the more accommodating to one's own personal needs, the round of interviews and meetings, until work and leisure coincide, becoming indistinguishable from one another. The opposite is the case at the bottom of the hierarchy, where compulsion to survive is the order of the day, and leisure degenerates into recovery time. On women. For when he reached Athens, writes Herodotus, with a report of the disaster, The wives of the other men who had gone with him to Aegina, in grief and anger that he alone should have escaped, crowded round him and thrust their brooches, which they used for fastening their dresses, into his flesh, each one as she struck, asking him where her husband was. So the poor fellow was killed. The Athenians were horrified at his fate and made them adopt Ionian dress to prevent them from wearing brooches. The anti-feminine bias of men derives from the fact that women do not traditionally engage in physical combat to prevent themselves from being enslaved. Again, I quote Herodotus. Whenever he encountered a courageous enemy who fought valiantly for freedom, Sesostris, a legendary king of Egypt, erected pillars on the spot, inscribed with his own name and country, and a sentence to indicate that by the might of his armed forces he had won the victory. If, however, a town fell easily into his hands without a struggle, he made an addition to the inscription on the pillar, for not only did he record on it the same facts as before, but he added a picture of a woman's genitals, meaning to show that the people of that town were no braver than women. The words I use on those occasions when I'm alone and split into adjoining solitudes I call poems. The thread of continuity I wind around my little finger. I beckon, and you come narrating. Hesiod in Works and Days writes, "And now I will tell a fable for princes, wise as they may be. Thus said the hawk to the nightingale with speckled neck, while he carried her high up among the clouds, gripped fast in his talons, and she, pierced by his crooked talons, cried pitifully. To her he spoke disdainfully, 'Miserable thing, why do you cry out? One far stronger than you holds you fast, and you must go wherever I take you, songstress as you are. And if I please, I will make my meal of you, or let you go.' He is a fool who tries to withstand the stronger, for he does not get the mastery, and suffers pain besides his shame." People would rather terrify others than be frightened themselves, but would still more prefer to be loved than feared. The problem is how to make the transition from a dominating to a voluntary relationship. I'm tired of begging the rapist to please get off. After I castrate him or her, I'll strike up an acquaintance. Quote, "From Ilion," says Odysseus, "the wind drove me along to Ismaros, in the land of the Siconians. There I sacked the city and put the men to death. We captured from the city their wives and much treasure, and divided it all among us, in such a way that no one went away deprived of his fair share." The army from Athens took no women with them, records Herodotus, but married Carian girls, whose parents they had killed. The fact that these women were forced into marriage after the murder of their fathers, husbands, and sons, was the origin of the law, established by oath and passed down to their female descendants, forbidding them to sit at table with their husbands or to address them by name. It was at Miletus that this took place. Miletus was one of the great Ionian Greek cities in southwest Asia Minor. I'm taking up a collection not of money, but of people, for the purpose of making a golem to shut down Clown Town and reopen it under new management. Andromache to Hecuba, from Euripides' play The Trojan Women. If I dash back the beloved memory of Hector and open wide my heart to my new lord, I shall be a traitor to the dead love, and know it. If I cling faithfully to the past, I win my master's hatred. Yet they say one night of love suffices to dissolve a woman's aversion to share the bed of any man. I hate and loathe that woman who casts away the once beloved and takes another in her arms of love. Hecuba, Andromache's mom, replies, give your obedience to the new master. Let your ways entice his heart to make him love you. If you do, it will be better for all who are close to you. The older I get, the steeper the roof of the house of image. Athena to Telemachus from the Odyssey. For you know what is the emotion in the breast of a woman, that she wishes to increase the household of him who weds her, and of her dead husband she neither remembers once he is dead, nor inquires. Famine in Babylon, Herodotus. When the moment came to declare their purpose, they herded together and strangled all the women in the city, each man exempting only his mother and his girlfriend. Quote, I mentioned at the beginning of my account, Herodotus continues, how during a siege the Babylonians strangled their women to save food, and it was in consequence of this that Darius, in order to prevent the race from dying out, compelled the neighboring peoples each to send a certain number of women to Babylon. In all, as many as 50,000 were collected there. It is from these that the present inhabitants are descended. Quote, after he had used every argument to persuade them not to abandon their wives and children and the gods of their country, one of them pointed to his private parts and said that wherever those were, there would be no lack of wives or children or gods. Herodotus. I grant that apple and apple tree are both alive, and being alive together, to some extent their fates overlap. But the rate of fate of apple and tree, of me and society, are so widely diverse, our lives so non-transferable, that if I had my way, I'd conduct the tree as if it were time to fall with me. In other words, more fruitfully. In the dialogue Cratylus, section 392d, Socrates remarks that the epic poet Homer says that the son of the Trojan Greek hero Hector was called Astyanax by the men of Troy. Since the child was also known by the name Scamandrius, Socrates concludes that the latter name must have been bestowed upon him by the women of Troy. Socrates does not trouble himself with the reason why the women named him differently, but it's evident that people coming from different countries and speaking different languages, who nevertheless settle in the same city, are likely to apply different words to the same referent, in this case to the son of Hector. And what might have happened is that early in the history of Troy, an invading and colonizing Greek-speaking army, who became known as Trojans, killed off in battle the defending adult males of an Oriental-speaking population, entered the city, and begot offspring on the widows of the slain warriors. For the woman's name Scamandrius is a compound word made up of scam, aner, which means sceptered man. The second element, aner, is Greek for man, but the first element, skam, S-K-A-M, is nearly identical with the Sanskrit root skamb, S-K-A-M-B, which means scepter. Now, since the Greek word for scepter is skeptron, it seems to me that, to the extent that the element skam of Scamandrius is etymologically closer to the Sanskrit root skam than to the Greek skep, the women are more orientalized than the men. Therefore, I speculate that prior to the Trojan-Greek conquest of the city, Troy was occupied by an orientalized population, the men and women of which would have called the royal heir Scamandrius, whereas the other name, Astyanax, derives from Proto-Greek astu wanax and means master or lord of the city. In short, Hector's son was called Astyanax by the men and Scamandrius by the women because the women continued to speak an oriental dialect of Greek after becoming the concubines of their Trojan masters. And in general, I surmise that any language which contains gender distinction, that is, in which certain words, seemingly in an arbitrary manner, which has nothing to do with the meaning of the words, are designated to be of feminine gender as distinct from masculine and neuter, serves as evidence that early in the history of the speakers of that language, or of the parent language from which it derives, Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, Hebrew, etc., the dialect of the conquered has held its own against that of the conqueror. Moreover, since the speakers of the defeated dialect were by and large women and children, the adult male population having been destroyed in battle, the vocabulary and inflection of the survivors came to be characterized as feminine. What the genesis of the neuter distinction is, I cannot say. Furthermore, the first generation of children of these unions of conqueror and conquered would have been bilingual, speaking their mother tongue until they were 5 years old, and thereafter, if they were male, their father's language taught to them by tutors. These tutors are the forerunners of modern educators, who continue to bridge the gap between the female-dominated world of childhood and the male-dominated world of adulthood. In this way, I explain to myself the otherwise inexplicable caution and deference of women in the presence of strange men. It is not that a man is generally stronger than a woman and can rape her if he sees the opportunity, but rather that historical precedent favors and martial law justifies the forceful seizure of women by victorious soldiers as the booty of war and for purposes of propagation. And when one contemplates the millennia of undisguised male disdain for women because women do not customarily risk their lives in battle in order to remain free, and the millennia of repressed hatred of men by women who must somehow sublimate their enmity toward their murderous husbands, lest their children, the offspring of slave and master, become deranged because of conflicting loyalties, one can only conclude that one has stumbled upon a grisly skeleton, which, because of its universality, as universal as human history, Freud mistook as an Oedipus complex in everyone's closet. Moreover, the modern tendency to sentimentalize the family serves only to whitewash the ongoing physically violent and psychologically vicious history of that institution, a history which coils like a snake in the unconscious of all of us. For however primordial its origin, the family, as it has been documented by ancient authors, is the product of war, not of peace, of brutality, not of love, of business, not of pleasure. In early Rome, marriage between noble and common families was forbidden. In the following excerpt from the Roman historian Livy, the author summarizes the arguments brought forward by the privileged patrician upper class of Rome against Gaius Cornelius, tribune of the plebeians, the lower socio-economic class of Rome, who proposed that marriage between members of the two classes be legalized. Quote, Gaius Cornelius was aiming to contaminate the gentes, that is, the gene pool of the upper class, and throw the auspices, both public and private, into confusion. Note, taking the auspices, that is, ceremonies devoted to the gods to ensure good luck, was the exclusive privilege of the patrician class. That nothing might be pure, nothing unpolluted, so that when all distinctions had been obliterated, no man might recognize either himself or his kindred. For what else, they asked, was the object of promiscuous marriages, if not that the plebeians and patricians might mingle together almost like beasts? The son of such a marriage would be ignorant to what blood and to what worship he belonged, that is, whether he should subscribe to the beliefs of the privileged and ruling class or of the underprivileged and subject class. He would pertain half to the patrician, half to the plebs, and be at strife even with himself. Unquote. The strife resulting from millennia of unions between recent widows and their husbands' killers is still too overwhelming for anyone to notice. In the following passage from Herodotus, the Scythian men have been away for nearly 3 decades on a military campaign. Quote, when they returned after 28 years, they found that their women, having wearied of waiting for them, had intermarried with slaves. From the union of these slaves with the women of Scythia, a new generation had grown to manhood, and when they learned the circumstances of their birth, they resolved to oppose the return of the army from Medea. Many engagements were fought, but the invading army could make no headway until one of their number thought of a new plan of attack. "My friends," he said, "what we are doing is absurd. In this war with our own slaves, we stand to lose both ways, by the casualties we inflict, no less by the casualties we suffer. For the more we kill them, the fewer we shall have when we are once again their masters. I propose, therefore, that we should stop using spears and bows and go for them, each one of us, with a horsewhip." When they saw us armed, they naturally felt that they were as good men as we are, and were meeting us on equal terms. But when they see us coming with whips instead, they will remember that they are slaves. Once they admit that, they will never try to stand up to us. The Scythians put the plan into action with immediate success. The opposing army was dumbfounded. Every man forgot he was a soldier and fled. The whip. The world offers 3 alternatives: loving the whip for the obedient, wielding the whip for the ambitious, fleeing the whip for the alienated. Since only the alienated stand to benefit from throwing the whip away, the hope of the species lies with them, colliding with each other in their flight from the whip, taking refuge in each other, emboldening each other. Eventually, the alienated will create the counter-whip, the revolution. Fighting back to back, loving face to face, takes good timing. When victorious troops did not colonize a fallen city, they often took the captive women away with them. For example, in Numbers chapter 31, the Israelites waged war against the Madianites, quote, and killed every male among them. But the Israelites kept the women of the Madianites with their little ones as captives, and all their herds and flocks and wealth as spoils. Unquote. After Moses commands the booty to be distributed, but fearing venereal disease, orders all but virgin women to be killed, the Israelites tally their booty. Quote, 75,000 sheep, 72,000 oxen, 61,000 asses, and 32,000 girls who were still virgins. Unquote. Mechanical sex. Fuck me or die. Repeat after me when I cue you. Ooh la la. Because the inhabitants of Seon refused to sell food and drink to the Israelites, quote, at that time we seized all his cities and doomed them all, with their women, men, and children, we left no survivor. Deuteronomy chapter 2. When the Benjaminites need wives, their own having been put to the sword, the Israelites suggest that they rape the women of Shiloh during a festival. When later the fathers and brothers of the women complain of the seizure, the Israelites reply, "Release them to us as a kindness, since we did not take a woman apiece in the war." Judges chapter 21. All the world is all wrong. Bessie Smith. One is bound to conclude that the whole thing, quote, one is bound to conclude that the whole thing is not worth the effort, and that in the end it can only produce a state of things which no individual will be able to bear, unquote. Freud on Civilization. Quote, one cannot live outside the machine for more perhaps than half an hour, Virginia Woolf, nor inside the machine, Miss Woolf, for more perhaps than half a lifetime. Quote, we combat the idealist, that is, the reformer as distinct from the revolutionary, for this reason alone, since he stands in the way of the transformation of human relationships, which have become intolerable. It would be of no importance even if everything we said against him were exaggerated. Bertolt Brecht. Again, Brecht. The revolutionary intellect is distinguished from the reactionary intellect by the fact that the former is a dynamic and, politically speaking, a liquidating intellect. The revolutionary intellect enters a non-revolutionary situation as a radical. He is against every party, even the radical party, and so long as he does not succeed in establishing it, he works to establish his own party. Otherwise, should he succeed, he is under anarchistic compulsion to liquidate his own party, unquote. In other words, the revolutionary is an elitist who must fight elitism until, the mass of the people having become revolutionized, elitism is passé. Quote, all undialectical concepts of man based on the assumption that human nature is a historically unchangeable constant contains an element of irrationalism and conservatism, observes art historian Arnold Hauser. Whoever does not believe in man's capacity for development usually does not want man and society with him to change. Pessimism and conservatism here condition each other reciprocally. But Freud is no more a real pessimist than he is a conservative or even an irrationalist. In spite of all its questionable factors, his work bears the unmistakable evidence of a spontaneous affection for mankind and of a progressive mind. It is not necessary to prove this, but there is no lack of proof. Freud certainly had no doubts in the power of reason over the instincts, but he emphasizes that we have no other means of controlling them but by our intelligence. And that is not a statement quite without hope. The voice of the intellect is a soft one, he says, but it does not rest until it has gained a hearing. This is one of the few points in which one may be optimistic about the future of mankind, but in itself signifies not a little. And one can make it a starting point for yet other hopes. The primacy of the intellect certainly lies in the far, far, but still probably not infinite distance, unquote from Freud. Half an inch a century, God flies to the rescue. Read history. Go back 1,000 years, agonizes Malcolm Lowry. What is the use of interfering with this worthless, stupid course? Like a barranca, a ravine choked up with refuge that winds through the ages and peters out in a... What in God's name as all the heroic resistance put up by poor little defenseless people, all rendered defenseless in the first place for some well-calculated and criminal reason, to do with the survival of the human spirit. Nothing whatever. Less than nothing. Countries, civilizations, empires, great hordes perish for no reason at all, and their soul and meaning with them. That one old man perhaps you never heard of, and who never heard of them, sitting boiling in Timbuktu, proving the existence of the mathematical correlative of ignoratio elenchi with obsolete instruments, may survive. Unquote. Ignoratio elenchi, Lowry explains, is the fallacy of supposing a point proved or disproved by an argument which proves or disproves something not at issue. Quote, the immense majority of individuals, responds Michael Bakunin to Malcolm Lowry, not only among the immense majority of individuals, not only among the ignorant masses, but also among the civilized and privileged classes, think and want only what everybody else around them think and want. They doubtless believe that they think for themselves, but they are only slavishly repeating by rote, with slight modifications, the thoughts and aims of the other conformists, which they imperceptibly absorb. This servility, this routine, this perennial absence of the will to revolt, and this lack of initiative and independence of thought are the principal causes for the slow, desolate historical development of humanity. For us, materialists and realists, who believe in neither the immortality of the soul nor in free will, this slowness, as disastrous as it may be, is a natural fact. Emerging from the state of the gorilla, man has only with great difficulty attained the consciousness of his humanity and his liberty. He was born a ferocious beast and a slave, and has gradually humanized and emancipated himself only in society, which is necessarily anterior to the birth of his thought, his speech, and his will. He can achieve this emancipation only through the collective effort of all the members, past and present, of society, which is the source, the natural beginning of his human existence. Unquote. All that the buried seed knows of light is reported warmly or coldly, moistly or dryly, but in any case darkly, by earth. Quote, if one wants to be an ox, then one can, of course, turn one's back on man's torments and tend to one's own skin. Unquote. Karl Marx. It can, quote, it can be said that the real and complete emancipation of every individual is the true, the great, the supreme aim of history, unquote. Michael Bakunin. No humanist can bathe in a tub of blood without asking whose. History is a wound. Why exacerbate it? Why not let it heal? Because she wears a sash of worms, because she wears a veil of flies, no God will stoop to fuck the earth, except proletarian Hercules. Quote, for the world would probably have come to an end round about the Bronze Age if everyone had stood up for himself to the last drop of his blood, reasons Robert Musil. Instead, the weaker have always meekly knuckled under, looking round for other neighbors, whom they themselves will be able to elbow out. This is the pattern on which most human relationships are based to this day, and time cures all ills. Here's a description by V. Gordon Childe of a full-dress parade led by a column of ants. Quote, at Ur, as at Kish, the ideas implied by the underground house were carried out through the same barbarous logic as at Abydos. The royal dead had been conveyed to the tomb on chariots or sledges, clad in full regalia. Not only the draft animals, but drivers, men-at-arms, courtiers, musicians, and ladies of the harem were obliged to follow their sovereign to the future world. In the shaft outside the king's tomb at lay no less than 59 bodies, including 6 soldiers in full panoply, and 9 women bedizened with costly jewelry. Unquote. All aboard the status quo, swing low, sweet status quo. In childhood, the family comprises the toddler's social totality. In adolescence, the peer group comprises the teenager's totality. In youth, the status quo comprises the careerist's totality. In maturity, the possible society comprises the revolutionary's totality. In seniority, we voluntarily rebirth into the new half-projected world of possibility, where the dialectic between the actual and the possible comprises the tactician's totality. As I age, I savor the brevity, the poignancy of this brief thing, my body, aware like nobody's business of itself. This I, this foaming head of will, has no more right to ownership of the body than the figure projected onto the screen ownership of the theater. Everything is possible. Where do I locate the self who observes myself? If outside the events of my life looking in, I'm under surveillance. If inside looking out, I'm haunted. Our bodies, which express themselves imaginatively, fund our mental flights together, but mind gets the credit. Body is shown the door. Consciousness corners the organ market. Please introduce yourselves. I'd like to know all my organs personally, Boss Consciousness ingratiates. Hey, con man, don't flatter yourself. You're just another organ, the organizing organ, the wheel, which has usurped the place of the driver. Con man is pissed. Who speaks without permission? Con man demands. Look, a body has myriad wills. Wills have imagination. Imagine us all at headquarters mapping out a plan whereby liver and heart are fewer miles apart, whereby the abandoned child is induced to emerge from the kidneys. All the organs know, perhaps the only thing they know, is that if one organ kills another or kills itself, everyone dies. But humans can kill each other or themselves without destroying the social body. Therefore, if humans associate, they do so voluntarily. Freedom's the message, mankind the messenger. The medium is the message. My body appointed me captain of a ship, guaranteed to go down with all on board. Having a body is like keeping shit and sugar in the same bowl.